Welcome everyone to today's webinar on a better way to view your mobile data with TracerPlus. I am your presenter, Joe Kraebel, and I am a mobile solutions architect here at PTS. So some of the topics we will cover today on data grids are what is a live grid versus a cache grid, kind of explaining the differences between the two, what the settings of the grid control configuration mean to do. We'll look at in a little more detail some of the settings available to you when using the data grids, whether it be live or cached. We'll demonstrate how to insert a data grid to your mobile form. We'll show you how to add that to a mobile form that I'm going to create and configure some of those settings. And then where to find more information and some real-world examples. So we'll demonstrate some of the uses of the grid controller, some of the more common uses where a grid control can be used in TracerPlus. I do want to mention that if you do have questions at any point during the webinar, please type them into your question panel, and we will address those at the conclusion of the demonstration. Okay. Now I will go to our website. So the page I have here is the TracerPlus Solution Center. So I'm actually going to demonstrate one of our Solution Center apps that has a grid control built in already. So I'll kind of show you how that was set up and how that works. So you'll see a bunch of different categories here that you can choose from. And we actually have direct access to this from within TracerPlus Desktop. So if we open our desktop software, we click on the Samples button. And let's say we go to the route accounting, for example. And if we looked at deliver goods, or actually package delivery tracker, I believe it is. Actually, nope, it's not that one. Deliver goods here. You'll see that this form utilizes a grid control. So this is a way to view live data that's expected for a delivery. So once you enter an order number, it's going to show which items you're supposed to deliver. And as you scan those items, it will remove them from that list. So you know that once that list is empty, that you've delivered all the items. So I'll just go ahead and import this, and we'll demonstrate this real quickly, and then we'll go ahead and show you how to create something like that from scratch. So we have two sessions here. We have our deliver goods as well as our deliver list. So the deliver list is going to house our order information or our items to be delivered. And the deliver goods session is the scanning that we're going to be doing, delivering those items. If we jump over to the form designer, we'll see our grid control here. So this was added via this grid option. And then we configured it by clicking on the data options and clicking on this little button here. And then we can define the columns as well as some various settings, as well as we jump over to the filters tab, how that grid's going to display information. So you'll see we're filtering it based on order number and the delivered basically of false. So we'll just deploy this over to my mobile device. And I'll just clear out our data here. So this is a sample project that we also include data for if you trial or used our TracerPlus Connect software, which is used for syncing data to and from the device. It's very seamless. You can sync via batch, wireless, or even in real time. So we have our Connect software here. I will just create a new profile real quick. Actually, you know what? I may have an existing one for this particular setup. So to save time, we'll just open that. All right, so I have some profiles set up here to sync to device. So this is going to sync our deliveries to our device. And if we jump over to the data view, we'll see some of our data here, which is probably used from a previous demo. So I'll just clear that out real quick. And we'll clear this out. All right, so we'll just enter some deliveries here. So we have, let's say, order number. If we look at some of our available order numbers in our drop-down list, we'll see that it's 1000001. And we can enter an item number, description, we'll say it's a desk. Enter another item for the same order. Say that's a chair. And we'll enter one more item for this order. And we'll say that's a hutch. And then maybe we have another order here that also has delivery of a desk and a chair. All right, so there's our deliver list that we want to push over to our device. So in order to get that to our device, we want to add a sync button to our form. So if we look at the deliver list form, I'll just add a button here. We'll call it sync deliveries. And we'll just set that to a button action of do sync. And then we just need to tell it what we're syncing from. So we need a host that we're going to sync from. So if we jump back over to our project settings and then connect, we'll just add a host. I'm just going to do a cradled sync. So we're going to add PPP_peer. You'll see that it has a host ID of 1. If you did want to do a wireless sync, you could enter the host or IP address of the PC running Connect. We jump back over, we have a host of 1. And now we just need a profile ID to sync. And if we jump back to Connect, we'll see that our sync to device profile is profile ID 1. We will just set this to 1. And then we'll deploy this to my connected device. That's going to push our project. And if we open the deliver list, we now see our sync deliveries button. If I bring connect into focus again, if I click this sync deliveries, oh, we got a login failed here. Let me just make sure I'm properly connected. So our sync's complete. You'll see we have 5 records now. And if we look at that deliver list, we should see there's our order number, there's our item number, there's our descriptions, and we'll see that none of them have been delivered yet. Now if we jump back over to deliver goods, we select an order number. You'll see that now once I select this first order, it's showing those 3 items that we are to deliver. So as we start scanning these items, you'll see that they'll remove from the list. And once we finish, the list is empty, and then they can go to the Acknowledge tab and have the customer sign for their delivery. Then the driver moves to his next stop, selects his next order, shows what should be delivered there. They scan, and then they can acknowledge for that. So now if we look at the deliver list, we'll see that those items have now been updated with the deliver state of true and a date delivered of today's date. So that is one common use for a grid control. So some of the other common uses are for actually accumulating data as you scan. So as you scan items, you can kind of see what you've scanned as opposed to having to exit the form, come to view data, and go to a deliver goods type view session. So you can actually see the data scanned without going to that screen or interrupting the flow of the data entry. So now let's go ahead and create something from scratch here. I'm going to go ahead and minimize this. We will create a new project. We'll call it create demonstration. So our first session is going to be the session that we're going to be scanning into. Typically, most grids grab data from a separate session. So we want to add a second session, like some sort of item list or deliver list. So we can say this first one is scan items. We'll say that this one is item list. All right, so let's say we're doing this by location, let's say. So in our item list, we have a location, and maybe we have an item number, and maybe a description. And we can have a status. That could be whether it was scanned or not, and then maybe we want a date scanned. So in our scan items, we're going to have a location. That'll filter down a list of items for us, and then we'll just proceed to scan items. So we'll have item, description, and we'll do a status and a date. Now, in order to update that item list as we're scanning items, we're going to want some update fields. So we can do update underscore status and update underscore date. And these fields can be hidden from view. So if we select location, we'll just make that a drop-down. Description, that can be a lookup into our item list based on our item number. We just set up a lookup, enable lookups. We're basing it off of the item number. If you did want more information on how to set up lookups or use lookups, you can check out one of our training videos specifically on lookups. I'm not going to dive too far into it as we really want to focus on the grid functionality. So we're going to be looking up our description fields. Status, we want to say, maybe we'll use a flag of 1 versus 0. So status will default to 1. This will be hidden from view. And we also want to make it read-only, and we don't want it to clear on submit, so that that's always a 1. Date, I'm going to grab today's date. We can make that read-only. And then update status. So these fields we want to make calculated lookups. So basically we're going to grab the data from the 2 fields above here, and then because we're doing a lookup, we're able to update the source item list with the new data. So if we do an update status, we set up that same lookup into the item list based off of the item number. And we're looking up the status. So in this case, we want to update that status in our item list. So we want to enable the update source. So this will then, as we scan items, it will update that status with a 1 based on this calc that we're going to set here. We're basically going to say, we're going to concatenate the data from the status field into this field. So it's always going to be a 1, so that every time we scan, it's going to update that row with 1. And that's what will actually remove it from our grid. Do the same for the update date. Item list based on item. And we want to look up our date scan, and we're going to update that source pulling from this date field. These don't need to be visible. All right, so now we will adjust some of our after scan settings here to control the flow of the form. So for the location, we just only want to enter that once. So we'll turn off clear on submit. So that enables the location to retain on subsequent scans, so we don't have to keep selecting the location. So location is going to go to item. Then item, we probably just want to auto submit and then go back to the item field. So we can kind of scan, 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 and we'll see the items removed from the grid as we scan. All right, so if we jump to the form designer, we'll go ahead and create our form. So what we want to do here is add a grid to our form right below our location field. So we can do that by clicking the grid option and then clicking on the form, and it'll present us with a grid control. And once you select a grid, you'll see some selected control properties on the right-hand side. So under data options, we can choose the columns that actually show up in our grid. So maybe we just want to see the item and the description. So I'll add 2 columns. Column 1 can be item, and then column 2 can be description. So now if we look back at item, we have some settings we can configure here. So one being a column width. If I just hit done now, you'll just see that it's a column width of 50, so it's not very wide. So we can adjust the width of these fields, or columns, I should say. So we go here, we'll set this maybe to 75. And we just need to choose a source field. One thing I forgot to mention before I added these fields is to make sure that you're selecting the correct source session first. So we want to make sure that we're grabbing this data or referencing this data from our item list. So we'll just have to re-add these. And then we choose the field that's going to show up in this column from that source. So we're just basically going to match it. So item should be the item number. Description should be the description. And now the filters to apply. Our first filter will be our location. So we can actually name the filter. We'll call it location. So this is what's going to determine what shows in this grid. So we're going to match the local location to the remote location. So any items found matching those locations, the location selected in our local session, will display in this grid. Let's just change our column widths. So we'll say 75, and then maybe this one will be 125. So you'll see that adjust in our form. I'll also hide the tab. And maybe we'll make this a little bit neater. All right, so let's just add some locations to our drop-down. We'll say room 1, room 2, room 3. All right, and now if we deploy this to our device, we should see a form that looks just like this. There's our location, here's our grid, our item, and description. So now we just need to get some data into our item list. Let me just clear out what we had here first. And I'll just enter some data real quick. Let's just say room 1, 1001, see, Dell PC, room 1, 1002, say Dell monitor. And we'll say 1003, say it's an HP printer. And maybe we'll add some stuff to room 2. And this can be a monitor. All right, so if we look at our item list, we'll see our locations, our items, and our descriptions. So that's what this grid is going to reference. So you'll see by default it's going to be empty because we haven't selected a matching location. Once we select this location, it shows our items that are located in that room. So if I scan an item, it's going to auto-submit. So right now you notice that it didn't remove from the grid because we haven't set that up yet. But you'll see that we should have updated the status with 1. So now, in order to have this removed from the grid, we need to add another filter. So we want to say, we go back to our item list, we go back to filters, we'll add another filter, we'll call it status. And we basically want to match the status fields to the status field in the remote session. But we don't want it to equal, we actually want to say not equal. Because the status is always 1 in our local field, but we want to show items that don't have a status of 1 in our remote session. So that's why setting it to not equal should now enable those to display once we select that location. Now once we scan and submit the item, it should no longer display. So if we jump into the form and select that same location, we'll see that only 2 assets are showing because our first one was already updated with that 1. So if I go back in here and clear that 1 out, you'll also see it was updated with our date. So I'll clear that out. So now it's blank. Should be blank. Not sure what's going on there. But if we select this location, we'll see our 2 assets, and as we scan them, they will disappear from the grid. So now all assets scanned for that room. If we select the next room, here's our other 2 assets. So we scan those, they will remove. So that's how you can actually display information based on a particular filter and then actually remove it when it's scanned. So another particular function that's useful to our users is the ability to view the data that they've actually scanned. So what I can do here is add another tab page. And we'll add a button here to move to that tab page. We'll call it View Scanned. So say there's a large list of assets or items that you're scanning and you want to be able to see what you've scanned so far. Since this particular grid right now is only going to show you what's remaining. So we'll say View Scanned. And then we'll have that jump to our second page. These are 0-based indexes, so page 2 is actually going to be 1. And then we'll add a grid control to this tab page. It'll be set up similar to what we've done in the past here. Maybe we'll put a label up top here. We'll call it Scanned Assets. We'll select our grid, go to Data Options. Once again, we'll add our 2 columns. We want to make sure that we're looking at the item list. We'll add our 2 columns of item and description. And description. width of 125, and description is our field. So the filters are going to be similar. We'll add 2 filters, one being location. So we still want to match location to location. And then for our status, this time we want the status to equal the status. So where 1 equals 1, it's going to show the assets that we've scanned. And we'll just add a button to go back to the previous page. Call it back. Go to page, and it's going to be 0 since it's page 1. All right. So now if we go to scan items and select a room, we see the items that we scanned for that particular room. We can do the same here for room 2. You can see that we scanned both of those items. So one other key feature of this grid is being able to what we call bind the data to a particular field or fields. So once we select an item in the grid, we can actually bind this data to fields on your form. So let's add a couple fields here. So maybe once we select this, maybe we want to see more details about the item. So we'll say show item and show description. And then we'll add 2 fields down here. So this field, this will be our show item. So we'll just select the source of show item. And this will be our show description. And what we need to know here to bind these columns is the control ID of each of these fields. So each control has a unique ID. So a good way to see what the IDs of your controls are is to click this ID button, which will now display all of your controls in the upper left of the control. So you'll see that show item is 20 and show description is 21. So if we click on our grid, go to item list, you'll see that we have a control binding setting here. So we can set a binding direction. So we want to go, in this instance, to control, as we want to bind it to a field. The from control is something we use for a cached grid, which I'll show in about 10 minutes. So we want to go to control, and then we just need to tell it what control to go to. So in this case, that's our control ID, and that'll be 20. We'll do the same for description, to control, and this one we want to go to 21. And now if we push this update to our device, you'll see that once we select one of these items, it should then bind their values to these 2 fields. So if we select a room, and now that we've selected this item, you'll see that now those 2 values showed up in the fields below. If I select another one, as I keep selecting them, they will change the values in those fields. So let's say you had, maybe some additional fields other than item description. Maybe you wanted to view, a serial number, maybe a make, a manufacturer, a purchase date, something like that. You could limit what's seen in the grid, and then as you click on an item in the grid, you can display all of that information in fields below. You can even make these fields read-only, so they're just for viewing purposes. So you'll see that's a very useful tool in viewing your information. Also note that binding can trigger lookups. So if you do have lookups, you could just bind the item number to the field and then have the rest be brought in by lookups. So you don't have to bind every field in that grid to your form. You could just bind the item number and then handle the rest via lookups. All right, so that's what I wanted to show you in terms of the live grid. There is one other use for this that I will show you. Is basically using this in place of a drop-down. Because you'll notice that this drop-down, we have 3 selections here. Even if we typed in a 4th selection, it would not add to this list. So we would always be room 1, room 2, room 3. So sometimes using a grid control as a drop-down is also very useful. So I'll go ahead and add a separate session here. We'll just call it grid drop-down. And then maybe we have a session that actually houses, locations. We'll add one called locations with just a location field. So this can be data from a database or imported from a text file, even manually entered, that the grid can actually reference. Whereas a drop-down, you can't reference a separate session for that data. So that's another good reason to use a grid as sort of a drop-down list or a pick list. So let's say we have our location, and then what we want to call update location. So update location is going to be similar to that status field and the date field that we set up in our previous session. So it's going to be a calculated lookup looking into our locations based on location to lookup location. And then we want to update the source and append if not found. So that's saying if we happen to key a location into the location drop or the location field, once we submit this row, it'll add it to our source session and then should now appear in our grid as a selection. So we just need to pull in the data from our location field. This field doesn't have to be visible, but I'll leave it visible for viewing purposes. Location, we're just going to select that from a grid. So I'll just build a form here, and we'll move these fields down, and then we'll add a grid. You can make the grid as big as you want. Then we'll just configure it. This should point to our locations session, and then we just want to add a column of location. Choose our location field, and then we have a width of 75. We're not going to do any filtering in this case. We just want to see all the data that is in the locations session. And the last thing we need to do is bind that to our location field. So once we select it in the grid, we want it to show up in our location field, which is 5. So once again, we just set up our binding direction of to control with the control of 5. And now we'll just push this to our device. And we'll add a couple locations in our location session. It looks like we have some data in here already, so let me just clear that out. Let's say room 1, room 2, and room 3. All right, so if we go to our grid drop-down session, you'll see there's our location choices. If we select an item, you'll see that it appears in that, and it also appears in our update location. So one thing you'll notice here, we see the columns. So if you're using a grid as a drop-down, you probably don't want to see the columns. So if we click on our grid, we have an option to show, actually not show toolbar, but actually hide the columns. So that right here, show column headers, we want to set that to false. So now if I push this update, we should only see the grid rows. So there's our location field. Obviously, we can make this grid a little smaller to match sort of the data that's being displayed in it. But you'll see the column is removed. We have a scroll bar. So as we select an item, now if we want to add a new item that's not there, we hit room 4, hit submit. You'll see now room 4 has been added to our location dropdown. So now, if we were using a conventional dropdown and we typed in room 4, we would have to type it in again, as that would not dynamically add to that dropdown. So using grids as dropdowns is a good way to dynamically update dropdown items, or even make it cleaner to select items. It may even offer a little bit more powerful filtering. Since dropdowns filtering, we only support single-level filtering. So you could picture using a series of grids to filter dropdowns, which I'll actually demonstrate in a more advanced setup once I demonstrate the cache grid. So this is an asset audit type session. So if I go into asset audit, you'll see that we have a site we can choose from, or sites. So you can see we've used grids here to sort of choose a site. Once we do that, you'll see it binds to the field. We hit next. Then it shows us all the buildings that are in that site. Once we select a building, then it'll show all of our rooms. If I select building 001, here's all of the rooms in our session. So if I select room 16, we can also tie a record count to each of these grids. So you'll see that we have 76 assets remaining in this building, but 6 assets remaining in this particular room. And once we select next, here's our assets that remain to be scanned. We also have a view scanned option here. So you'll see as we start scanning, they'll accumulate into the scanned grid. So I'll start scanning some assets here. So you'll see as we're scanning, it's being removed from the grid like you've seen before. And if we look at view scan, it's going to see the 3 assets that we've scanned already. If we wanted to, we could come back. You'll see that this has now been updated to 73 remaining and 3 remaining in this particular building or room. If we click a different one, we see we have 2 assets. Scan those, and those will get removed. View scanned, there's the 2 we just scanned. And we can go back, change location. So you'll see that we have 0 remaining in this room, but 71 left in the building. If I select another room, we'll see that we have 1 in that room. And then one other function I wanted to show you is a location lookup. So based on the location you select, say I wanted to just look and see what was left in the site. So you can see in this particular site, we have 213 assets remaining. We've scanned 5, and there were 218 total. We're using radio buttons here to actually filter this grid down to show the different steps of data here. If I wanted to select a building, that'll filter that down even further. We have 76 assets in this particular building. We've scanned 5, and 71 remain. We could drill down even further to the room. We'll see that we have 3 remaining, 3 scanned, 6 total. So you'll see how powerful and seamless adding grid controls to your form can make data collection. So we go to asset tracking. So we see an RFID asset quick scan. So this basically allows you to select a location and then scan all the tags in a room. So it's going to consist of just a scan RFID tags. It's a pretty simple session. We're just selecting location and then scanning a bunch of RFID tags. The way we set that up, so let me show our control IDs here. So you'll see that there is a cached mode option. So there's cached versus live. So a live grid is just basically a live view of the current or existing data. A cached grid is a way for you to queue up your scans before you actually submit them or post them to the database. So basically we would queue up a list of tags that we've scanned, then hit a submit button, and then it would post all of that data with that single click versus having to scan, submit, scan, submit, scan, submit. So it really speeds up the data collection process. You'll see we have cache mode enabled as true, and then we have some cache mode options of we can actually hear beeps when we add rows to a grid. So if you're scanning a bunch of tags, you'll hear a bunch of beeps as you're scanning. Once the beeping stops, you pretty much know that you've hit all the tags. And then if we look at some of our grid settings here, so the cache grid gives you a few more options under the control binding. So binding direction, in this case, it can be both, but typically it would just be a from control because we want to grab it from the tag ID field or from the field, versus in the other case we were binding it to a control. So this grid, we actually want to grab the data and place it in the grid. So that's why we're doing from control. Bound control, the tag ID is 103. And we can choose to clear the control on binding. So as we're scanning tags, we can actually clear the tag ID field. Is this a key column? So it's basically triggering what's going to add this to the grid. Is it based off of this field? So this is our key column. So if we do scan this item more than once, it will not add twice or 3 times. No matter how many times we scan it, it's only going to show up in that grid one time. You can choose to require it in binding. So that means that if this value is blank, it will not bind to the grid until this item is populated. So we could say true here. Triggers binding, so we can say which field actually triggers the bind to the grid. Depending on what type of data you're entering, you may want to trigger that at a certain point. And then we just select our source field like we've done on the previous grid. Location. So we do want to grab the location. So any field that you actually bind to a cache grid, so if you do want to include, location or date, you have to make sure that you do add it to the grid, otherwise it will not capture that information. So that's why we added the location and the date. But you'll see the column width is set to 0, as we don't want to see those fields, so it's going to be hidden from view, but it'll actually grab the data and enable us to post it along with that tag ID. So once again, we want to set this to from. It's bounding from 101, which is our location field. Clear control, nope, we don't want to clear the control on this because we want to retain that location field. It's not our key column, that's our tag ID, but we would want to require it in binding so that if we just started scanning tags without selecting location, that it wouldn't bind to the grid. And this does not trigger the binding, so we set that to false, and we see our source is location. Lastly is the date. Once again, 0 column width, so we don't see it. Bound control 6, which you'll see our little field off the form here, our date. And then everything else can be false. Since the date time is auto-populated, we don't really have to enable the required. And then there's no filter for this. And if we just look at our RFID settings, so we're set to read in hexadecimal with a full radio power. And we're basically directing any RFID scan to the tag ID field with this smart form rule. And we're also, one other feature here, so record count control ID, that's how you can display the record count of a particular grid. So this doesn't have to be a field. So if I actually delete this, and then I just add a label, and we'll just call it count. So we see that that has a control of 15. Once we go to our grid, we can say record count control ID, we want the record count for this grid to show in 15. So I'll just deploy this to my Android device since we're having some Windows Mobile difficulty here. So here's our scan RFID tags. Since this is a very large resolution, you'll see our form's a little bit missized. So what we can do here is actually change the size of our form to fit a little bit better. So you'll see the reason it looked kind of jumbled up like that is we do have it set to auto scale. So you can auto scale your forms on Android devices. All right, so that looks a little bit better. We can control the font of the grid. So you'll see that once we click on our grid, we can set its font. Maybe we want to set it to 20. That gives us a little bit larger display on this particular device. But if I select a location, you'll also see our record count here is 0. And if I just start entering items, you'll see them start adding to the grid. I don't know if you can hear that, but there's a faint beep each time I add something new. If I scan something existing, you'll see that nothing happens. And then we just need a post scans. So you'll see that I'll post all 10 rows. We view our data. We probably have some leftover stuff from our previous entry, but you'll see it posted these 10 records. Here's our room, our date, and then our tag IDs. Here's the other remaining 2. Picture waving an RFID gun around the room, and then mass scanning RFID tags. But you can actually catch that on some of our training videos area where we actually demonstrate a UHF RFID mass scan and actually goes into more detail in actually setting up an application to do that if you're interested in doing so. So I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. Here's our contact info. Follow us on YouTube. We're posting a lot more videos lately, so you want to check out some of our new videos. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter for certain announcements, or join some of our LinkedIn groups. Also want to mention that all the software I did show today is available for free trial. So if you go to our TracerPlus.com website, click on Take a Trial. You can actually, desktop is a free download, and if you want to trial out our Connect software that I showed in the beginning for syncing data, you can download the trial here. The mobile client is included with desktop for Windows Mobile or CE. And for Android, you can get us on the Play Store, or you can download the APK directly if your device doesn't have access to the Play Store.